Good afternoon and welcome to the International Quilt Study Center's great new building, which Barb and artist James, who have been in large measure responsible for making this happen, like to call Quilt House, a homey title for a very sophisticated enterprise. But then that is what has intrigued so many of us about quilts for some decades. Their multifaceted being, their ability to engage our attention at so many levels, the comfort of the home, their craft, their sophisticated design, history, sentiment, lore, and love. These things have invigorated the study and understanding of quilts in recent decades. While many extremely interesting things centered around quilts are taking place all over the world, including this country, it is to me very gratifying that in what was universally acknowledged as America's heartland, a succession of very smart people have seen that the center of the world's study of quilts should be here. I have to tell the truth, I can't imagine if I would ever have come to Lincoln, Nebraska had not the center been established here 10 years ago. But having now made the journey many times, I need to acknowledge my affection for Lincoln, but more particularly for the extraordinary people I have come to know and love here. I know that with their typical modesty, this will embarrass them. You embarrassed, everybody? Okay. But I want to say publicly that I have dealt with museum staffs all over the world and that this staff is outstanding by any measure. Their level of professionalism, their dedication, and their affection for what they do is simply the best. That means, that means I will probably get an extra dessert tonight, when in fact I usually can't even finish the first. Have you all noticed the size of the portions of the desserts in Nebraska and the portions? I assume you have. Okay, so it is an appropriately outsized place for an outsized subject, and today I will deal with one part of it. I will talk about the new museum's first exhibition, curated by my friends Carolyn Ducey, curator of the collection, and Maren Hansen, perhaps better known to her friends by her middle name, Freya, curator of exhibitions. I will pretend we are in the gallery looking at the exhibition together, and in fact, I'm going to try to get through in time so that we can walk through, and I'll be happy to spend all the time until the museum closes talking about the quilts or whatever you'd like to discuss, so I'd like to leave some time for that. Carolyn and Freya, hereinafter to be called the curators, and yes, for those of you who are wondering, Freya was named after a goddess, and she will tell you what that goddess was if you ask her later. Decided to do two things with their first exhibition, showcase some of the masterpieces among the center's 4,000 quilts. Is it what is the number now? 2,300. We have a capacity for 4,000. And also demonstrate some of the remarkable, in their words, commonalities in design elements, construction techniques, and symbolic and thematic content. Well, that's a pretty big bite, but I think we can do it if we stick together and stay awake. So I'm going to start by telling you a story about collecting quilts illustrated by one of my most important except for moments. When Gail and I began to collect quilts in Pennsylvania in 1969, we were finding them all over the place. In little antique shops, house sales, large antique markets with many dealers, and notably at several open-air antique markets that flourish in Pennsylvania in the good months. The sort of quilts that we were initially attracted to because of our interest in modern art in general, and particularly the New York painting of the period, were, of course, those that looked like modern paintings, like these. These were all found in Pennsylvania during this period, and these were the kinds of quilts that initially attracted us to them, because they resonated so much for us in terms of modern art history, especially the paintings that was going on in New York at that period. Now here we are in New York, and what I'm doing with this quilt was what we did with everyone we collected. We hung it on a wall, and this was our living room. We photographed it and analyzed it, and each one taught us something. That's a quilt next to a painting by our friend Terry Severson. And so right from the beginning, we were beginning to hang quilts with big modern paintings, and people were seeing that. And that's the kind of stacks of quilt that we were collecting. That's, you know, we lived in this was a good-sized apartment, but not huge, but this was the kinds of things we were bringing home, and the Volkswagen bus we stayed in when we were on the road. And And I tell the story about my little daughter who walked through these, eventually the apartment just had stacks of these quilts up to about there with paths through them, and my little daughter once, at 6 years old, looked at me and said, if you die, will I inherit these? Absolutely horrified at the idea, of course. And this was our bedroom wall. And so from the time we began to collect quilts, we looked at them when we got up and when we went to sleep. And we found that was a very good way of beginning to understand quilts. We would talk about them and look at them. And I'm going to throwing in this last slide to remind those of us who were there of our glorious hippie days when all we had to worry about was quilts. And we had a budget. Everyone asked me what did quilts cost in those days. We had a budget of $36 a quilt. That was what the most we would pay. But once I found this one, and it was dated 1856, and every one of those in German, old-fashioned German script, had a name and a place. It was an amazing Pennsylvania quilt, and I paid $56 for it, and I was afraid to tell Gail for 2 months. I lied, in fact. Gail and I had a horror of high-fashion, late Victorian silk and velvet quilts, particularly the so-called crazy quilt. This is one from the collection that's just the full boat. It's got everything on it. What is this called, Carolyn? The what? My Crazy Dream. My Crazy Dream. Well, we just thought these were the enemy, and I remember once walking down Fifth Avenue with Barnett Newman, the great abstract expressionist painter, and we went past a shop window, and there was this fabulous Tiffany vase in it, just amazing. One of those great ones that he did personally. And I said, Barney, God, isn't that amazing? He said, John, that's the enemy. So I always remembered that. My favorite of crazy quilt of all times that we saw when we began early in our collecting experience, when museum people who curated textiles were delighted to be asked to show quilts. No one ever went in and said, can we look at your quilts? We couldn't believe how eager everyone was to haul out quilts that no one had asked to see in 50 years. In the St. Louis Art Museum, we saw a crazy quilt that was it was like this, but more so. There wasn't a single Victorian decorative technique that hadn't been used. Painting, applique, 3D. There were two stuffed birds on it. It was phenomenal. And right in the middle, there was a little black velvet patch that had some writing on it. When I looked at it closely, it said in silver thread, "I wonder if I am dead." And I thought, there it is. Okay. Well, with our very superior attitudes of the time, we vowed we would never own such things. Until, and there was always an until, one day we saw this quilt, which now graces a wall in the exhibition and has appeared in many of the articles about the opening of this wonderful space. This quilt, which we included in my first book on the subject, has been copied around the world more than every other quilt we ever collected. So, why that moment? Eureka moments are always remembered because they're times when something changes dramatically, usually forever, your worldview, an insight that takes you to a new and important place. It is not the Southern Italian colpo di fulmine, the thunderbolt that strikes with love at first sight. Rather, it is an intellectual moment of awakening. What we saw in this silk and velvet quilt, with the great use of ribbons to make the zigzags, and the single little strip of so-called crazy random piecing from crazed, as in pottery, by the way, and in my opinion, derived from the craze for things Japanese in the late 19th century. This is a style of Japanese work that is very, very old in Japan and was sold. These are little wooden boxes, and they were sold at all the Japanese expositions which began in Europe and the United States in the late 19th century. I find them all over I found one in a house in Cazenovia where I lived where there was a little article about it that we tracked down to the local newspaper. I think this was the origin of the crazy quilt because it appears just before crazy quilts appear, and women were collecting them. It's a very old Japanese technique. They made boxes like this, they made little stands and things. Okay, so we saw this quilt and it changed everything for us because she had the brilliant idea of just compressing the strip of crazy stuff right in the middle. Here using the overly sumptuous silks and velvets of the period, cloying in most crazy quilts to make an extremely bold and individual statement, kind of thumbing her nose at the then current establishment way of doing things. See that little strip? I know how to do crazy quilt work, and I could if I wanted to, but I don't want to. The ability, as this artist demonstrates, to take an established pattern or way of doing things and totally change it to form something completely different. Quilt makers do this all of the time, we eventually learned. It taught us to expect the unexpected in quilts, and in that we were never disappointed. And it also taught me that the only good rule is probably one that can be violated with impunity. At this distance, the quilt looks like a spider on LSD, or someone on LSD looking at a spider. And that's what it looked like to us when we found it, having just finished our hippie days. But there is another quilt in the exhibition that looks even more like your worst nightmare came true, that is, if you suffer from arachnophobia. Now, as the curators point out, this was not a Norwegian design, although it was made in Norway. It's a design that originated in the United States and has always had the nostalgic name of log cabin block. I'm sure most of you know why, because its construction technique is like the overlapping logs of a log cabin. But what's brilliant about this design is that it's always half light and half dark, so you can manipulate these to form many different larger overall patterns. This is just one of them. I was pleased to see this juxtaposition in the exposition because it demonstrates how American quilt making ideas were exported even in the 19th century to countries with their own textile traditions. Scandinavians with an ancient history of wool weaving brought those traditions to the New World when they migrated here in the 18th and particularly the 19th centuries. Now here at least, one of them learned American quilt making methods, and our curators suppose that someone who decided Nebraska was not the place for them and returned to Norway, I can't understand why, taxes, portions weren't big enough, took these with them. They also point out that the quilt has no batting, but it was made like a big pillow cover so a woven blanket could be inserted. So just as Americans modified the crafts they brought with them from the old world to adjust to the conditions of the new, so old world artists and artisans modified what was coming from the new to suit their own conditions. And most of the Norwegian quilts I've seen in a book that I just saw in Maren's office use black centers. But the great majority of American log cabin quilts use red centers. So Robert Rauschenberg, in one of his breakthrough paintings, put together from things he could easily gather because he had made he had little money then, famously used a log cabin quilt as part of his famous painting called The Bed. This was a 1950s painting for him, was a great breakthrough painting. And there's one of those red-centered, well, this is actually courthouse steps. It's a courthouse step style block, but there are those red centers that Americans favored for these. This was 1955, 16 years before the exhibition Gail and I did at the Whitney, which introduced more Americans to their quilt heritage. And Rauschenberg, who was an inclusive genius, knew the dramatic associations Americans made with quilts, and he was also keenly aware of the graphic power of the log cabin block. The curators called this part of their exhibition dynamic lines to note the way in which lines of color can be manipulated to form dynamic, usually active patterns. And they included one of Michael James's quilts to show us how a modernist eye works with the same idea. Again, using strips of material in wonderful color combinations. So we're looking at quilts that are probably about 100 years apart, approximately. There are only a few things that give visual form to the surface of a quilt. Material, assembly techniques, piecing or applique, and quilting. Can you see that on the right? It's a white-on-white quilt. Of course, one could say a similar thing about a painting on canvas. There is only the paint and the brushwork. That's the painting on the left is by Ad Reinhardt, and this one is on the right is by Barnett Newman. And the attempt was to hide everything, including the brush strokes that formed the surface. So this is during the time of big color field painting in New York. This is the point that the curators made, that as painting has the mark of the brush and sculpting the tool marks, so quilts carry the marks of their maker's intention on their surfaces. A Welsh quilt in the exhibit shows us how two of these elements can be manipulated for effect. Here, the surface decoration is the designs created by quilting. As the curators point out, the maker used a shiny material to manipulate the light reflecting from the surface, which would emphasize the quilting patterns, and the batting is thick for the same reason. A world away in Pakistan, a woman used a very similar pattern in reverse applique in her quilt, that's the next one, and in Brooklyn, New York, Lucinda Holstein in 1867 used very similar ideas, even to the reverse applique of the Pakistani quilt, which is this. So there's the same idea of these four leaves, Welsh, Pakistani, and a Raleigh, and here's the same idea coming up, and even with the reverse applique in a quilt made in Brooklyn in 1867. Here, the surface effect depends upon the intricate manipulations of cut material. This is the whole Raleigh, I believe, coming up here. And the sewing is basically hidden. The combination of the two can be seen in the Hawaiian quilt in the exhibition, where patterns derived from earlier island decorative art, in my opinion, primarily the tapa cloth, common to Polynesia, a kind of beaten bark cloth decorated with designs executed in various natural paints and dyes, plus techniques learned from New England missionaries. It is known that in 1820, the wives of two Hawaiian rulers were invited aboard a sailing ship that had brought missionaries to the country, and according to the story, the missionaries were building houses on board, and the women lived on the boat until the houses were ready. And the wives showed the Hawaiian women, the courts, how to make patchwork. One website offered this nugget of information. Before Captain James Cook arrived in Hawaii in 1778, he collected kapa with large, rudimentary, brushed-on designs. After Hawaii's contact with the outside world, kapa designs evolved into more intricate and regular geometric patterns. Hawaiian women already knew about folding to make patterns and using large patterns. All right, there's the tapa up on the right. That's a traditional early tapa cloth. And they simply invented their own way of making quilts, folding and cutting in the same manner as the German immigrants to Pennsylvania, and that, of course, is this other one in the exhibition, which is in the Scherenschnitt, the folding and cutting tradition that came from Germany with the settlers. And that uses the same sort of quilting patterns and relief we saw in the Welsh quilt to enhance the surface, cable and grid patterns, in the Pennsylvania quilt, and the outline quilting in the Hawaiian. As I understand it, in some Polynesian societies, certain tapa cloth patterns were the prerogatives of particular families, ruling lineages, and that this custom was carried over in the early days of Hawaiian quilting, that certain families owned certain patterns and other families wouldn't make them. They were the prerogative just of certain families. The retention of ancient designs is something we see continually in quilts, perhaps one of the few decorative arts in which designs from its early origins are still in active play. Oh, there's another Hawaiian quilt from the collection. In fact, it's the only other Hawaiian quilt of this type from the collection, with these very large patterns derived from tropical foliage. And there it is, compared to the Welsh quilt. I'm sorry, but I'm sorry that you can't see, it has very similar quilting patterns as to those in the Welsh quilt. We just can't see it. So the retention of ancient design we see continually in quilts, and it is perhaps one of the few decorative arts in which designs from its early origin are still in active play. Where you're seeing a very early quilt on the left and then a more modern quilt on the right. Our curators called this ancient symbolism and used as its prime examples, well, let me show you a few others. There's what we call postage stamp, and there's a very recent one, 100 and some odd years apart. The one on the left is quite an early example. And there's another example of these retentions of these early designs in an Amish square, which is itself a retention of an earlier one, and then its interpretation in a contemporary quilt. Our curators call this ancient symbolism, and its use and used it as its prime example in the exhibition, a quilt made with 2 panels of cotton made in India, probably in the 18th century, and incorporated into a late 18th or early 19th century quilt. All right, those are 2 panels of the great textiles made in India. There could be little in textile history more romantic than the story of Indian cottons and how they came to the West, and it is linked to the story of the spice trade. Many intelligent people have made this study their life work, but I will try to run through it in record time. Spices are most likely the most anciently traded commodities worldwide. The trade existed as early as 3,000 years before Christ and was largely controlled by Arabs until the European age of exploration. At one time, Venice was the European center of the trade, later Portugal, the Dutch, and finally the English. There was continual struggle for centuries to control the trade because of its incredibly lucrative potential. At a time in the medieval period when the Italians were the main brokers, it was said that you could send out 6 ships, lose 5 of them, and still make a good profit for the whole venture on just the 6th. One place where spices were grown and processed was the Spice Island group, and one of the main bartering commodities for spices were cottons from India. India had been the source of beautiful, color-fast cottons for many centuries. They had mastered the techniques of mordant dyeing, which gave their textiles their printed and painted patterns their lasting qualities. In the 4th century, St. Jerome famously said, "Wisdom is as enduring as the dyes of India." For Europeans, the trade as it developed went something like this. Gold bullion to India, buy cottons, trade the cottons for spices in the Spice Islands, take the spices back to Europe and sell them for gold, go back again. And they did this very successfully. The first Indian cottons to come back to Europe in any quantity were brought back by the English's Honorable East India Trading Company, chartered by Queen Elizabeth on December 31st in 1600. And granted a monopoly. I don't know why they picked New Year. There must have been something about the turn of the year or something. They were granted a monopoly on trade with the East. English domestic textile production of the period was largely limited to wool and linen, though silk was being made in Italy and a few other places. James I tried to introduce it to England in the 17th century, but the venture failed. While wool, linen, and silk could all be woven and dyed in beautiful textures and colors, they lacked the practicality of the great Indian textiles, color fast, much easier to clean, sturdy, eminently workable for almost any textile purpose. These textiles were, of course, an instant sensation, so much that there was fear they would destroy the English woolen industry, and they were banned in both England and France, the English following the French in this regard. Passions ran so high that women wearing chintz dresses were accosted in the streets, stripped of their clothes, and left to run home naked. That was true. That actually was recorded. The great novelist Daniel Defoe railed against them, but eventually conceded correctly that women's passion for fashion would rule the day, and he was right. They were offloaded on parts of England and brought in as contraband. They were smuggled in. When anything is that lucrative, someone's going to find a way to do it, as we all know. So eventually they had to give up their restrictions, and then they started taxing them, naturally. But the influx of these wonderful textiles reshaped Europe's textile industries, and using the methods they learned from the Indians resulted in the great European cotton textile manufactories. Among the things imported with Indian cotton whole goods were palampores, and there you can see the tree of life. Panels that could be used for a variety of purposes, but were largely seen as bed covers and actual quilts. Here's an 18th century Indian quilt. That's an actual quilt with a silk back. These textiles transformed not only English textile manufacturing, but the design of making of quilts and much else in fashion. The quilts with decorative centers and borders, as in this Indian quilt, directly influenced early English quilts. You get the decorated center, you get the corners, and you get the decorative borders. And that form did not really exist in English or in continental design until these English textiles began to come in. So the first great format that we see in quilt making in England was really came from the influence of these Indian things. The tree of life motif, which you see there so clearly on the left-hand one, as a single one dominating the entire thing. And there you see that same format, the center square, the decorated borders with swags, and then the decorated corners. There's the tree of life, facing each other, same idea. This tree of life motif, which is, you can see notably there, is one of the most ancient in the world. That is from Assyria. That's from a relief they found at Assyria, and that is the Assyrian tree of life. That was it's among the earliest human ideas about the origins of life, etc. It came into the medieval world through the Jewish Kabbalah, which was one of the foundations of medieval thinking, and this shows a medieval alchemist or philosopher holding the tree of life. That's in Hebrew, but it had various motifs that we would still recognize as being important attributes of humanity. And so the device was carried into the medieval period, the tree of life, and of course carried into Christian symbolism through the idea of the Garden of Eden. Though it was changed from the tree of life to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as here. As an aside, the Michelangelo tree of life, that's from the Sistine Chapel on the left, was turned from a positive, the tree of life idea was turned from a positive image associated with women, as in this goddess from Knossos from 1600 years before Christ, where snakes were always associated with fertility and with women, and to the cause of man's downfall, along with suspicions about Eve that have apparently, if unjustifiably, been current ever since. But in any case, there was a remarkable change about what the tree symbolized. So this design, whether or not it had the same symbolism for Indians, became an important motif in quilts, first in the whole cloth as it had come from India, as in the exhibitions quilt, then as a beloved and continuing motif in quilts to the present day. Our curators have included Polly Ann Nesbitt's 1850 Tree of Life quilt in the exhibition, the one on the right. This is interesting for a variety of reasons. We see the simplification of the image as a quilt goes from a folk art image, from a formal image to a folk art image. We see that same sinuous border we saw in some of the palampores. The tree of life becomes very often shown in a pot. It has the same kind of impossible botanical combinations we see on these trees, etc. So there's a kind of direct folk translation from these great palampores, the Indian textiles, to the folk art tradition. The other thing is, of course, is that in English design, the kinds of exotic designs they were getting at the time went into Adams-esque, went into period design, and these kind of floral borders and things are also descended from English formal design of the Adams S type. The motif remained popular some centuries later. Here in Joan Lintolth's quilt in the exhibition Uncoiling Snakes, you get the full treatment. I have to admit that looking at this quilt, I had almost the same feeling when I first confronted the St. Louis Museum's fully loaded crazy quilt. There was nothing more that could possibly be added. But when you think about it, to get from there to there is not such a stretch. To get from that Palampore to there is not such a stretch. It's really, I have, the Indian textiles looked as exotic to those who first beheld them in Europe as this quilt did to my eye, as Joan's quilt did to my eye when I first saw it. My eye trained to value modernism in its minimal notions, or as Mies van der Rohe put it, less is more. In Miss Lintolth's quilt, the idea seems to be more is best. But you'll have it, if you haven't seen it in the gallery, it's a wonderful quilt to study. And I have to admit that I have now moved from my earliest position of inviolable orthodoxy, the only good quilts are peace quilts, to what I hope is a more nuanced appreciation of all that makes quilts what they are. Everyone gets a chance to grow up, and I think Miss Lintolth's quilt is at the edge of imagistic experimentation in contemporary quilt making. And I didn't mean that she got a chance to grow up, I meant myself. Still, and if I have to tell the truth, if I had to pick a sort of quilt to look at every day, to see when I wake up and when I go to bed, it would be one like this. And here's why. I am too old to start or end my day in an agitated state of mind. Amish quilts were teachers when we began to collect quilts in Pennsylvania. We did not find our first one until after we had been collecting for a year or so. And I've told the story before, so those of you here who have heard it will have to forgive me. Now my children, whenever I start telling stories they've heard before, hold up fingers. They just go, "Dad." So you're allowed to do that if you've heard me tell the story before. We were just driving on a road in Route 30 in Pennsylvania, and we stopped at a little antique shop that was run by a school teacher who only did it in the summer months because he couldn't afford to heat it in the winter. And it was his avocation, he loved it. And I went upstairs, and there was this quilt over the springs of a brass bed, and I went crazy. And I said, "Gail, could you come up here for a minute?" She was down chatting with him. And then I said, "Look at this quilt, I can't believe it, oh my God, it's the best thing." I said, "Wait, calm down, let's go down and talk to him." So I went down and I said, "Well, what do you want for that quilt on the bed?" He said, "No," he said, that's just covering the springs. I'm selling the bed." And he said, "The quilt goes with it." I said, "Well, you see, we're hippies." I said, "You see this bus out here? We sleep in that. We can't possibly put that brass bed in there, and I'm sure someone else is going to want the brass bed. So how much do you want for that?" He said, "Well, I want $11 for everything." So I said, "Well, couldn't we come to some kind of an accommodation here? Because I don't know what we'll do with the bed." He said, "Oh, all right, I'll tell you what. I can't split it exactly down the middle because that wouldn't be fair to me. So that means $5.50 for the bed, $5.50 for the quilt. Make the quilt $5.75. So that's what the quilt cost. So we carried that quilt around. And as I was saying this afternoon to someone who we were talking to, we forget what the difference is now in the way we think about money. When I looked back through our field journal, I found we were paying $16.85 or $22.75. Now people would say, "I don't know, give me $25. I don't know, give me $20. That $2.75 made a lot of difference to someone. The 85 cents, the 25 cents made a lot of difference to him. And it did to everyone then, when gas was $1 or 90 cents a gallon. We forget, it's very easy to forget that. In any case, we didn't know that this was Amish. So we started carrying it around, showing it to everyone, saying, "Have you ever seen a quilt like this?" And no one had ever, I don't know. But we had put it on the wall in New York in the bedroom, and we looked at it every day and every night, and it was just too, when you see an object like this, it's almost certain it isn't some genius woke up in the middle of the night, went, oh my God, I'm going to make this fabulous thing. It's too good. The quilting was too fantastic. It was too sure-handed. The sense of colors, the use of materials, the proportions were too certain. And traditional cultures don't tend to make huge breakthroughs in things. Traditional culture objects tend to come up in a very logical way. You can always, it's not a great genius breakthrough like a Picasso or a Velázquez or someone who changes the history of art. It comes very slowly. So, and we kind of learned that by this time. So we said, well, there must be more by someone out there. So finally, someone showed us, we showed to someone in Pennsylvania, they said, oh, well, that's an Amish quilt. Oh, we said, well, where can you find them? Well, they don't sell them, he said. They don't, you can't. Well, so we started going around looking for them. And first it became apparent, and we began to find them finally, but first it became apparent that most Amish quilts of the classic period, say 1890 to 1940, about 50 years, had been made in just a few patterns. That is the quilt as it hung in the Whitney. And that was the first time, that's that first quilt, Amish quilt we found, and that was the first time an Amish quilt had ever been shown publicly in the Whitney show. And as an aside, here is the zigzag quilt hanging in the Whitney. That's what it looked like in that very first show. All right. So we discovered that there weren't that many Amish quilt patterns. There were just about 4 or 5 main ones. Center square, that's the earliest center square we ever found, where the outside is wool and the inside is a silk wool combination from the 1880s, which they didn't really use after 1900. And then bars and center diamond and sunshine and shadow. Now, there are other patterns that they used, but the Amish of the Midwest used many more patterns, piece patterns, that they got from their neighbors. The Amish in Lancaster County seem to have used this very early pattern that we've seen in those early English quilts and just kept on making it. There are the corner blocks, there's a decorated center, there's the surrounding border. It's like a schematic of that early high-style quilt derived from the Palimpors. They just kept on making this format. And the other thing was that there were no names for these, so when I wrote about them, I just made up names. And if there's designs that haven't been named, it's like if you discover a mountain, you get to name it after your daughter, So there were no names for these, so we just named them center square, bar, center diamond. The sunshine and shadow did have a name. So those names have nothing to do with what the Amish call them. We have no idea what the Amish call these patterns. They didn't really have names for them. These were all made up by us. So that began the great Amish quilt rush when dealers like Robert Sholkoff and Joel and Kate Copt and others were down in Amish country scouring it every weekend for Amish quilts, because the minute the Whitney show happened, and there were a few other shows I circulated the first show of Amish quilts in 1976, and gradually the art world discovered them, and so people who liked Albert's paintings and other modern paintings found that this was a really cheap way of decorating their expensive New York apartments, because these cost just a fraction of what these paintings cost, and they were just as good, in some cases better. So this great rush began, and George Sholkoff, these wools have a very peculiar quality, not peculiar, we have some textile experts here who could explain it, but the more light you put on a white cotton quilt, the more you wash it out. But the more light you put on these quilts, the better they get. They glow. They just glow because of the nature of the wools, which were very fine wools. Some of them was silk warps that were being imported from Germany and sold by peddlers, especially the Greenberg family, to Amish people in Lancaster County. And they do have this remarkable quality of just glowing. Robert Sholkoff described it in the New York Times as they look as if they were made under moonlight, which I always thought was a terrific way of looking at it. Well, why this intense interest in Amish quilts? The and pieced quilts in general. The exhibition came at a time when New York was the center of the international art world. The generation of the abstract expressionists, Barnett Newman, such people as Barnett Newman and Mark Rothko, Newman on the left, Rothko on the right, and others were still very active. They were doing these big color field paintings, which look like Amish quilts. And the next generation, Rauschenberg, Johns, Lichtenstein, Warhol, etc., were all coming along. The classic European modernist view that had been a transplant to these shores was still ascendant, which meant an attempt to transform the classic concerns of traditional painting, figure, landscape, and architecture to a different form, and eventually forge a new painting that did entirely away with those traditional anchors, conveying thought and emotion through such means as pure color. Newman's large color field paintings were typical of the times. That's called Who's Afraid of Red, Blue, and Yellow? And that's a Rothko. Newman's large field color paintings were a typical time, as were Rothko's. The same sort of colors we see in Rothko's paintings can be found in the intense palette of Lancaster Amish quilt makers working with their fine wools. There's a Amish quilt on the left and a Rothko on the right. And these kind of colors that we were seeing then in Amish quilts that were being seen by the art world were the kind of tense, passionate colors that a lot of artists were exploring at that point with that flatness. Remember what I said about the light? These things have the flat texture that Barnett Newman was always shooting for. I've watched him work endlessly on a painting trying to hide all semblances of the brushwork so that you could get right next to the painting and never see how he did it. And these quilts had that same kind of quality. As the curators note, the square and rectangle have been seen since the dawn of Western civilization as perfect images. The Amish format, for instance, the center diamond with its balanced formula, is really a conservative retention of a late 18th century high-style English and American quilt format. There's the Amish quilt on the left, and there's a 1820s quilt there, and this one is also about 1820, all done in wools. And look at those two. So too with the other formats, for instance, the bars, what we call the Amish bars. There's the Amish on the left, and there's a strippy quilt or a columnar quilt on the right. So when we see what New Yorkers in the 70s saw, here's a quilt with two Albert's paintings, homage to the square, which were part of the common heritage of modern painting by that time. It is easy to understand what all the fuss was about. It was like discovering a hidden, unexpected treasure. Additionally, there was the added fun of noting the irony of people who rejected modernity and all of its trappings and conveniences, making such modern-seeming work. There was that wonderful kind of irony that the art world loved. But as the curators have shown us, the Amish were not the only ones making such quilts. Remarkable similarities, as yet unexplained, exist between Amish quilts and traditional Welsh and some French quilts. The French van in the exhibition, in both color and proportion, is similar to the great Amish quilts. So is the fine quilting, though the French van shows the great patterning of many early French quilts. Patterning and quilting. You can see the typical cording in French quilts, which we look for in these. There's another similarity, that of use. Our curators note that a van is a small piece made to lie on top of the bed for decorative effect. High-style Amish quilts of the classic period equally appear to have been made more for show. They were very thinly stuffed, the earlier ones with lamb's wool pulled fine, and many we and others collected show the careful preservation of treasured family objects. And that I remember once being in an Amish home, and most of the Amish quilts use, from Lancaster County, use a really finely patterned back, but they don't use any kind of imagery. And I turned over one, which is in the collection here, which had a very small print floral back. And I said to the woman, wait a minute. I knew her, so I could joke with her just a little bit. I said to her, I thought you weren't supposed to use patterned cloth. And she turned it back and she said, God only sees the top. The square continues to hold its appeal to something innate in humans and continues to be a form explored by both artists and quilt makers. Witness Ruth Eisfeldt's Atlantis in the show with its subtle use of color tonalities. And here's on the right is a great work by the very well-known modern sculptor Richard Serra. The art world celebrates the artist and his or her work. We are too often left to wonder who made the quilts we admire. Modern quilt scholarship has been a voyage of discovery, but one that has been on a very fast track. Researchers at the center have done often brilliant work in discovering the authorship of a number of wonderful quilts, using often just a few hints, some initials, a date. They've become really good at doing that. Where we have firm knowledge of authorship, it can deepen enormously our understanding of a work of art. Lucinda Ward Holstein made her so-called reconciliation quilt in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War, when that great conflict was still fresh in the American consciousness. It is not surprising that her quilt has a number of images related to that world-changing event. Sailors, Zouave soldiers. There's a Zouave, which was a New York unit, which wore very flamboyant Middle Eastern-inspired costumes. Patriotic themes, you know, the flags, the eagle. Here's a black man saying, "Master, I am free." The pairing of a white man in fancy dress on his chair with a now free black working man on his chair, and the meeting of Jefferson Davis, which gave the quilt its name, with his daughter when he was freed from imprisonment at Fort Monroe. Well, just as Lucinda Holstein's quilt informs us of her life, politics, family, the world around her, Faith Ringgold's quilts do the same thing. Her work in the exhibition, The Women, Masked Face, quilt number 1, has a mate that the center does not own, The Men, Masked Face number 2. And this is what she had in part to say about it. These were the first 2 quilts that I did for my very first exhibition at the Bernice Steinbaum Gallery in Soho. I had this idea that I wanted to do this mixture of visions of African American women and visions of African American men, and call it the men and call it the women, and show different faces of these 2 people. Because the mask is your face, the face is a mask. So I'm thinking of the face as a mask because of the way I see faces coming from an African vision of the mask, which is the thing that we carry around with us. It is our presentation, it's our front, it's our face. I was trying to say something. I was trying to use this, the African vision, but telling an American story. I guess I had fun doing it, but it was hard memories for me. I was pleased with the results, but every time I look at both of these pictures, I feel a little bit of the pain I felt trying to put it together. I had something I was trying to say, and sometimes the message is an easy transmission, and sometimes it's a difficult one, but I love the power of saying it, so I'm going to do it whenever it's hard or easy, because I love the idea that I can just say it. So that's just a wonderful statement from a quilt maker about why she works, what her works do. And she's made other quilts that are typical of showing scenes from her life, of city life, The one on the far right must have been visiting France with the children because it's called Dancing in the Louvre, which I love, with of course, the Mona Lisa behind and two other famous paintings. Identity can go from the large to the very small, in fact, the microscopic. Here's a quilt by Barbara Wattler in the exhibition that the curators included in the same section that they called Expressions of Identity. Wattler's called her quilt number 9 triple bypass. Those are the 3 that are in the show. And we might assume it is the artist's own fingerprint. In fact, Carolyn Ducey tells me it was the fingerprint of a wanted criminal she took from a wanted poster or something she found. I want to show it with a painting made by a very good friend of mine, the artist Tony Berlant from Santa Monica, which he called imprimatur. These two people do not know each other or each other's work, so this is rather remarkable. That's the quilt on the left and the painting on the right. While we think of such quilts as Holstein's and Ringgold's as autobiographical and capable of telling us so much about the maker, in fact, all quilts do that, for even if we do not know who made them, we can deduce something about them from scale, choice of materials, design, and finish. Some, like the Baltimore album-style quilts in the exhibition, yield tantalizing clues about their origins, yet remain elusive. The artist or artists who created these so-called Baltimore album quilts really invented a whole genre of applique design. One name has emerged, Mary Simon, who may have designed and even made many of the blocks, of the fanciful blocks that appear in many of these quilts. It is possible that she supported herself, as many women did then, with her needlework, selling blocks to people who wished to contribute to friendship album quilts. These are grand, high-style works, halfway between folk and formal, perhaps inspired by earlier broderie purse quilts. Here's one, and here's the broderie purse where things were cut out of chintz and sewn down. And here is the folky version. Because these were printed, these are from formal chintz patterns, they have real academic style. But here's the folky version of that. It is tempting to think that there was indeed one professional who made applique quilt parts for sale when we see the border of one of the Baltimore album quilts reflected exactly in a feathered star of the same period. So here, this is fascinating because here, now, it's a feathered star and it has none of these fancy Baltimore appliques, build-up appliques, but yet it almost looks like that's cut out of exactly, and was it made by the same person? We don't know. We don't know. Like New York painting of a given period, which is instantly identifiable, so too are some of America's regional quilt styles. These, the quilts of the Lancaster Amish, those of the Midwestern Amish, the bright-pieced quilts of Pennsylvania. Yet, even if we know the artists or where they were made and when and of what, quilts, like all works of art, remain mysterious in their workings, especially when they are as moving and evocative as those chosen to inaugurate what I know will be a brilliant future of exhibitions at our new quilt house. And I thank you.